Of all the blogs and essays speculating that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was man-made, this one seems to have got the most attention, so I am happy to take up the numerous requests and challenges for me to fact-check it. It's by someone called Nicholas Wade. Who's he? According to one poster on the forum, he's a well-respected journalist with a 30-plus year track record who used to write for Nature magazine and the New York Times. Unfortunately, you can't assume he's got everything right by simply having a bit of faith and weighing up the credibility of any journalist based on their experience, reputation, and track record. If that was the case, then Wade would actually be off to a pretty bad start, because he doesn't have a great track record of accurate reporting and he has a pretty low reputation among the scientific community for getting his facts straight. Fortunately, fact-checking isn't about personalities. It's about checking someone's source to see if his claim matches. So even a journalist with a great track record can get things wrong, and even a journalist with a terrible track record can get things right. Neither can you assume that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has fact-checked his piece because it's not a peer-reviewed journal. I can't go through the whole thing in a short video, and it includes a range of arguments from politics and personalities to hard science. My beat is the science, but whatever I choose to debunk, I could be cherry-picking. So I asked people on the forum, who cited Wade's essay, to pick the most convincing piece of scientific evidence that they found to support the idea that the virus is man-made. They cited Wade's critic of the Nature Medicine study by Anderson et al., the seamless method of genome manipulation, and a claim about a National Institute of Health funding brief. So let's go through them. You could start with this takedown of Anderson's letter to the Journal of Nature Medicine, as this was the main basis for your strong claim that it was not lab-made. Just to be clear, I'm a complete idiot, so I can't make any such claim. I can only tell you what the science says. It's the science that shows it's man-made. If you have some personal, political, or religious belief that leads you to reject scientific conclusions, that's fine with me. This is the part of Wade's claim that deals with the Nature Medicine study. According to Wade, a second statement that had enormous influence in shaping public attitudes was a letter, in other words, an opinion piece, not a scientific article. This is the study he's referring to, and his claim that it's just an opinion piece is inaccurate and very misleading. Firstly, it's listed as an article in the correspondence section of Nature Medicine. A correspondence article is certainly less than a peer-reviewed paper, but it's more than just an opinion piece, unless you consider inferences in science to be nothing more than opinions. The correspondence section of Nature Medicine is a forum for professional researchers, and articles published there still have to adhere to scientific principles. The scientific evidence, methodology, and inferences presented in correspondence articles can be responded to, corrected, confirmed, or disproved, just like any other published study. Far from being disproved or corrected, the article, authored by senior virology researchers from the Scripps Institute, Tulane University, the University of Sydney, the University of Edinburgh, and Columbia University, has been cited by over 3,000 scientific studies. Wade goes on to say, the discussion part of the letter begins, "It is improbable that SARS-CoV-2 emerged through laboratory manipulation of a related SARS-CoV-like coronavirus." But Wade didn't. The leads say the virus had clearly not been manipulated. Actually, no, it didn't say that at all. What it said was, our analyses clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus. If you think what Wade says means the same thing as what the authors said, why did he need to change it? As I explained in my video, the scientific method made easy. The word show in a scientific paper means something has been demonstrated scientifically. Taking that word out completely changed this from a scientific inference based on the evidence provided into an opinion based on dogma. When the correct wording is put back, there's nothing contradictory in these two terms at all. For example, the fossil and stratigraphical evidence clearly shows that animals evolved over billions of years. The reason this is called the theory of evolution is that science can never rule out the possibility that they were placed there by aliens or popped into existence at the whim of a deity who cleverly arranged things to look as though animals had evolved over time. It's just that such an event is improbable. As far as substance goes, Wade criticizes two claims made by the authors of the Nature Medicine article. Wade says, first, they say the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 binds very well to its target, the human acetyl receptor, but does so in a different way from that which physical calculations suggest would be the best fit. Therefore, the virus must have arisen by natural selection, not manipulation. If that's all the authors had said, then Wade could be forgiven for thinking the inference doesn't match the evidence. In fact, what the authors show is a lot stronger and more detailed than just that one short sentence. Another part of the virus spike protein that binds to the acetyl receptor in a human cell is called the receptor binding domain, the Nature Medicine article explains that 5 of the amino acids that make up the aren't found in other SARS-CoV viruses. So that's one piece of strong evidence against manipulation. When researchers are trying to see how close a natural zoonotic virus is to becoming infectious, they want to make as few changes as possible to just get it to that point. There'd be no point in spending time and effort replacing 5 out of the 6 amino acids. The other strong piece of evidence is that these radical changes wouldn't be expected to work anyway. Researchers always run calculations first to see what effect any change might have. They don't do things willy-nilly by trial and error. That would just be wasting their time. The Nature Medicine authors discovered that computation analyses predict that the interaction is not ideal. In other words, those changes are unlikely to work. So again, no point in doing them. Because while lab researchers wouldn't waste their time coming up with weird and inefficient structures that are unlikely to work, nature does it all the time. Because it works not by calculation, but through a process of trial and error. So there's a lot more evidence than Wade's simplistic summation. A good example of how evolution comes out with odd and counterintuitive designs is easier to see in this example. This hand has wrist bones for swiveling and an intricate array of knuckles, fingers and a thumb, perfect for grasping branches, picking up food and fashioning tools. It looks like an example of something intelligently designed for its purpose. Except it's not a hand. It's a remnant of evolution inside a dolphin's flipper. An intelligent designer wouldn't have bothered spending time and effort coming up with a pointless and intricate system of wrist bones, knuckles, fingers and thumbs, or, if you prefer, ankles, tarsals, metatarsals and toes, to put them inside a flipper where they can't be used. But the hit and miss approach of evolution throws up all kinds of oddities like this all the time, not only in the animal world, but in the world of viruses too. So Wade is firstly misquoting and then completely misrepresenting the author's evidence and their conclusion. The problem is that most people don't read the study. They just read Wade's summary of what he claims the study says. Wade goes on to say, the author's basic assumption, not spelled out, is that anyone trying to make a bat virus bind to human cells could do so in only one way. First, they would calculate the strongest possible fit between the human acetyl receptor and the spike protein with which the virus latches onto it. Then they would design the spike protein. But the reason that's not spelled out is because that's not the author's assumption. It's Wade's assumption that that's how virus research is done. The authors know better because they re virology researchers themselves. Researchers in this field are not looking for the strongest possible fit. As I explained earlier, they re trying to determine how close a natural virus is to infecting humans, a transition known as spillover. So they re looking for the minimal number of changes needed for a possible fit. Wade then tells the virology researchers again how he thinks they do their job. And again, he gets it wrong. This ignores the way that virologists do, in fact, get spike proteins to bind to chosen targets, which is not by calculation, but by splicing in spike protein genes from other viruses or by serial passage. The authors aren't ignoring Wade's imagined account of how they do their research. They happen to know that researchers in this field do make their calculations first, and then they get the spike proteins to bind to chosen targets based on those calculations. How many of the people who were convinced by Wade's essay actually bothered to check the Nature Medicine article to see if it says what Wade claims it says? Wade's next argument against the Nature Medicine article concerns the nature of the virus backbone, which I covered in my first video on the origin of SARS-CoV-2. I said this: when researchers are bioengineering a virus, they usually don to build the entire thing from scratch. What they interested in is the business end of the virus, called the spike proteins. They house the receptor binding domain, the VERBD, where the virus attaches itself to the host cell, and the cleavage sites, where it breaks in and enters the cell. So, except in exceptional circumstances, they build the spike proteins onto the structure of an existing infectious virus. I suppose the best analogy is graffiti artists. They usually don to spend lots of time and money building an entire wall from scratch in order to spray paint their art. They find an existing wall and use that. Wade doesn't dispute the fact that virologists use existing backbones in their research, or that the SARS-CoV-2 backbone is novel, but he argues that researchers might have built it themselves because, he says, backbones are quite easy to make. So it's possible. Since he does to quantify how easy it is, we need to check his source and find out. Unfortunately, as so often in his essay, he doesn't give a source. It's just his assumption. Since Wade has no expertise in this field, we need to find out from a real research virologist how easy it is to make a novel backbone. A couple of researchers I spoke to thought it would take years, and when I did a search online, I found that the Ben-Hur-Lee lab, which does research in this field, says making a new backbone takes months or even years. Robert Gary, a professor of microbiology and immunology at Tulane University and one of the authors of the Nature Medicine study, didn't even think it was possible. He told Business Insider, "People just don't know enough about what makes a virus pathogenic to be able to assemble that. So quite easy varies from a few months to impossible. But even if we take the lowest estimate of a few months, why would any researcher bother? After all, researchers are trying to see how close a virus is to spill over, and that's why all their research is focused on this, the spike protein, the infectious part of the virus. They don't need to spend time, effort, and money trying to build a completely new backbone." And Wade dozed to explain why they would, except he assumes it's quite easy. Using the analogy, when most of us see something like this, we'd say it clearly shows that someone spray painted a rock. We wouldn't seriously entertain the idea that someone took time, effort, and money to buy a lot of gravel melted in a furnace to make the rock, and then go to even greater efforts to make the rock look perfectly natural. I think we'd all agree that such a pointless and time-consuming exercise is improbable. The more obvious and simple explanation is that someone's just spray painted a rock. It's a principle known as Occam's razor. Wade closes the section on the Nature Science paper by saying, "And that's it." These are the two arguments made by the Anderson group in support of their declaration that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was clearly not manipulated. Well, that's not quite it. First of all, this wasn't a declaration. It was an inference based on the evidence that Wade mostly misrepresented. Secondly, there was a lot more in this study than just two arguments, and certainly a lot that's very different to Wade's two-line misquotes. He continues, and this conclusion, grounded in nothing but two inconclusive speculations, convinced the world's press that SARS-CoV-2 could not have escaped from a lab. Again, they certainly weren't inconclusive speculations. They were very detailed and very conclusive. But you wouldn't know that if all you read was Wade's inaccurate summation. It isn't the world's press that was convinced by the Nature Medicine study. It's unlikely most journalists read it. It was thousands of virology researchers who cited it in their own research papers, like these ones. They were convinced because they read professional researchers who didn't see these scientific inferences as inconclusive speculations. They did read the study and they did understand it. That's why they cited it. So we'll move on to the second poster, who asked me to fact-check Wade's essay. He wrote, "I think the most important part to address there would be where he talks about the seamless method of genome manipulation." Here's the part of Wade's essay being referred to. Wade says, "Unfortunately, this was another case of poor science in the sense defined above. True, some older methods of cutting and pasting viral genomes retain telltale signs of manipulation, but newer methods, called no-seum or seamless approaches, leave no defining marks." But the authors aren't arguing that cutting and pasting viral genomes retains telltale signs of manipulation, or that it represents any kind of evidence that SARS-CoV-2 is natural. This seems to be an argument Wade has invented himself, just so he can knock it down, which he then proceeds to do. He says, "But newer methods, called no-seum or seamless approaches, leave no defining marks, nor do other methods for manipulating viruses, such as serial passage, the repeated transfer of viruses from one culture of cells to another. If a virus has been manipulated, whether with a seamless method or by serial passage, there's no way of knowing that this is the case." Anderson and his colleagues were assuring their readers of something they could not know. But Anderson and his colleagues weren't trying to assure readers of anything of the sort. They never even mentioned it. No one's trying to argue that there might or might not be telltale signs of manipulation. It's irrelevant. It's the fact that these features are there at all, which shows a natural evolutionary path. The no-seum technique is a method of gene insertion used in cloning. It doesn't mean we can't see these new genetic sequences, so it doesn't affect the evidence at all. Going back to the example of a hand inside a dolphin's flipper, I'm equally happy to accept a creationist argument that any intelligent designer could have done this without leaving any incriminating tool marks. But that's not the point. It's the fact that all these hand bones are in there that argues against intelligent design, because an intelligent designer wouldn't have bothered with all these pointless and complex design features. And we can see transitions for some of these changes, just as we can see the pathway to many of the odd and counterintuitive features of SARS-CoV-2 and other viruses. On to the next argument in Wade's essay that someone said is the most convincing. The poster critic gave this example, so again, this is his choice, not me cherry pick. Look at this section. This is the grant from NE. Kapanik then quoted part of a National Institute of Health grant document addressed to the Wien Institute of Virology, which has a brief laying out what its funding is to be used for. Kipanik then explained. What this means in non-technical language, he said, is that she set out to create, but wait a minute. This is just a huge chunk of text lifted directly from Wade's essay. This is what Wade thinks it means. So how do we know he's understood it, or that he's explaining it accurately? The good news is that Wade gives a source for his claims, which means it can be easily checked. This is the NE funding brief he's referring to, and he even quotes the section of the document he's referring to. Wade claims it instructs Drashee, the researcher, to create novel coronaviruses with the highest possible infectivity for human cells, which, if true, would be an incredibly reckless and dangerous thing for any lab to do. Making the most infectious virus possible is the recipe for a terror weapon. And even if you believe that there was a conspiracy to make such a weapon, it would be a bit odd for the United States to fund such research in China, and odder still, that it would be spelled out in a publicly available document. So wherever else you think this conspiracy is being played out, it's certainly not in the document Wade's citing, or in the passage he cites. As I mentioned earlier, the spillover potential of a naturally occurring virus means the potential of the virus to mutate into a form that can infect humans. So researchers need to identify which of the many viruses found in nature is closest to this point. In other words, the idea is to make as few changes as possible to the spike protein just to get to the point where spillover will occur, not to make the most infectious virus. The reason for doing this is it helps predict which of the viruses in nature is closest to becoming infectious to humans. Wade compounds his error by adding, the methodical approach was designed to find the best combination of coronavirus backbone and spike protein for infecting human cells. I found it very hard to believe the NE brief said this, because it's funding research into the infectivity of the virus, which doesn't come from the backbone, it comes from the spike protein. As we've seen, for experimentation purposes, researchers simply pick a backbone off the shelf. And when I searched for anything resembling this claim in Wade's source, I couldn't find it, and Wade doesn't quote it. So that's the problem with believing Wade on the basis that he sounds credible, or assuming he has a good track record as a science journalist. So those were supposedly the most convincing pieces of scientific evidence in Wade's essay, not picked by me but by people on the forum who responded when asked. Of course, now that this has been addressed, I have no doubt it will be answered with the what about arguments. What about the rest of Wade's essay? What about this blog or that video? What about something else? All I can say is, always, even if I had time to make 100 videos a year in order to whack down every new misunderstanding and misquote that pops up on the internet, you don't need me to fact-check this stuff anyway. You can fact-check it yourself. Wade asks why virologists don't make the same claims he's making. It can't be because he's wrong. It must be because researchers are all corrupt. As with climate change, evolution, and every other scientific conclusion that people don't want to believe, they use the standard fallback position that scientists don't risk having their next grant application turned down. I've covered this default excuse in several videos. If the research conflicts with your belief, it can't be because you're wrong. The research must be wrong, and therefore all the researchers must be corrupt. The simple fact of the matter is that other virologists don't contradict the published science because they've ascertained that the published science is correct. Finally, if you're seeing ads on this video, it's because we now monetized the channel and have made Health in Harmony the beneficiary of the income. Health in Harmony is the charity that I've been asking people to support if they want to support this channel. So if you want to find out more about it, take a look at the links in the video description. and for those who've donated in the past. Thanks very much for doing so, and I hope many of you will continue to donate in the future, even though we now have advertisements running. If you're not seeing ads on this video, then that's due to me pathetic technology skills.